नहमदुहु व नुसल्ली अला रसूलिहिल करीम अम्मा बाद फ़अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम अर्रहमान अल्लमल कुरआन खलक़ल इंसान अल्लमहुल बयान. What I've just recited is the first 4 verses of Surah Rahman, and as all of us know, Surah Rahman is one of the most beautiful surahs of the Quran. It has an intrinsic beauty. The language is very nice to hear, and in fact there is a divine music in the whole of the Quran, but there is something special about this particular surah that makes it very nice to listen to. However, in addition to the language, the message of the surah is also extremely powerful. And I just recited the first 4 verses, and there is a special relationship between the ayat of these first 4 verses. The first ayat was Ar-Rahman. Now notice in these 4 verses, there are 4 superlatives or 4 pinnacles that are mentioned. The first superlative has to do with the attributes of Allah. So Allah has many attributes. There are ahadith that refer to 99 attributes or 99 names of Allah, and those names are largely attributes. Of all the attributes of Allah, the one that is the most important to us is Ar-Rahman. Now what does Ar-Rahman mean? Ar-Rahman comes from the Arabic word raham, which means mercy. And those of you who are somewhat familiar with the Arabic language will recognize that attributes can be hyperbolized. So what that means is taking a word and presenting it in its strongest, most extreme form. So when Allah calls himself Ar-Rahman, that means that he is immensely merciful. So that, and why is that so important? There is a saying of the Prophet where he told us that without the mercy of God, none of us will enter heaven. So the point is that of all Allah's attributes, the one that is most important or most significant for us is his attribute of being Ar-Rahman. Then the next verse of Surah Rahman is Allamal Quran. God has taught us so much. So everything that we know has come from God. So God has taught us science, God has taught us history, geography. So there are many disciplines that God has taught us, and there are disciplines that we don't even know right now that we will learn later. But of all the things that God has taught us, the one that is mentioned over here is the superlative of all the knowledge that God's given us, and that's the knowledge of the Quran. So Ar-Rahman, superlative in terms of attributes. Allamal Quran, the Quran is the pinnacle of what God has taught us, and it is also the most significant manifestation of God's mercy. Then Khalaqal Insan. Now here Allah is talking about his creation. Obviously Allah's created everything. He's created all animals, he's created the world, the universe, the stars, the moon. Of all of Allah's creations, the one that is referred to here is Al-Insan, Khalaq Al-Insan. And we all know from the Quran that when Allah created the first human, he asked the angels to prostrate in front of the human. So the point being that of all Allah's creation, the pinnacle of Allah's creation or the highest form of Allah's creation is Insan or the human being. And then the 4th verse says Allamahul Bayan. So Allah taught him, human beings, Bayan, which means the ability to express or the ability to communicate. Now if we think about our human faculties, we can see, we can hear, we can smell, but there are other animals who can see better than us, they can hear better than us, there are animals who can smell better than us. The attribute that is the pinnacle of human existence is the ability to communicate. If we think about how humanity has evolved, a major reason for why one generation knows more than the previous generation is the ability to communicate. If we could not communicate, then all the work done by a given generation would be lost. So we need to recognize that of all the attributes Allah has given us, the pinnacle or the superlative is al-bayan, or the ability to express oneself and to communicate. So how do we put all this together? These 4 superlatives or 4 pinnacles have been mentioned in 4 very brief and very beautiful ayat. To understand how these 4 connect, let's look at some ahadith. The first hadith that I will mention, and I'm not taking the full, I will not be talking about the entire ahadith over here, just relevant segments and the meaning of some ahadith. There is a hadith narrated by Hazrat Usman radiyallahu anhu, where he tells us that the Prophet told us, the best of you are those who learn the Quran and then teach the Quran to others. So how do we connect this with what we just saw in Surah Rahman? We are the best of creation. The best of our abilities or the best of our attributes is the ability to communicate. The best knowledge that Allah has given us is the knowledge of the Quran. So what that means is that the best way for us to use our ability to communicate should be to teach the Quran. And obviously to teach the Quran, we need to be able to learn the Quran ourselves. So the best of us, according to the Prophet, peace be upon him, are those of us who learn the Quran and teach the Quran. So the question might come up, what about all these other disciplines? Should we not learn those? And what we see from the sayings of the Prophet and from our own experience, the more we study, the more we learn about science or other disciplines, the greater our ability to understand the wisdom of the Quran. So we can and should learn other disciplines, but that broadens our horizons, broadens our perspective, and makes it easier for us to understand the depth of the Quran. But we should all recognize that ultimately the highest form of learning and the highest form of teaching is the learning of the Quran and the teaching of the Quran, and that is what we are being taught over here. There is another well-known event from the life of the Prophet where towards the end of his life, once he had delivered the entire message to the people of his time, he collected all the Sahaba, all the Muslims of the time. He reiterated the key messages, the key concepts of Islam. And then he said, have I communicated the Quran or have I communicated the religion to you? And everybody said yes. And then the Prophet, he told the people at that time that now those who are here should take the message to those who are not here. And if you think about it, that's ultimately how we've received the message of the Quran. That's how we've received our religion. The Sahaba at that time went all over the world to teach the Quran, to teach Islam. And then over history, over time, the message has been passed down. And this message now is with us, and it's our responsibility to learn the message and to take it forward. We need to take this as a responsibility that we have to learn and communicate. It's not something that's optional. We've been told by the Prophet to do this. And as we read the Quran, we should try and read the Quran of today. So what does that mean? The Quran has guidance for all people across all time periods. And the more we study the Quran, when we study the Quran in today's day and age, we can try and identify issues and problems that we face today. And if we read the Quran carefully, we can find solutions to our problems of today in the Quran. Now, obviously, those who read the Quran 1400 years ago, they found solutions to their problems at that time. The Quran is a living book, and as we keep reading it, we keep learning from it, and as new issues come up in our lives, we can use the Quran to solve those issues. The next hadith is attributed to Hazrat Umar, so narrated by Hazrat Umar. Here he tells us that the Prophet told us that through this book, Allah will make nations rise and Allah will make nations fall. So what does this mean? What this means is that when nations follow the teachings of the Quran, they will rise. And the most classic example of that is the Sahaba of the Prophet. When they followed the teachings of the Quran, the Arabs became the dominant nation of their time. When the Quran was revealed, or when the Quran started, the revelation of the Quran started, the Arabs were extremely backward people. So small tribes fighting with each other. On the world map, they were not mentioned. At the time, the two big empires were the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. So those were the two major world powers at the time. But within a few decades of the Quran being released or being revealed, the message of the Quran was internalized by the Sahaba. They would follow the teachings of the Quran, and then they achieved immense greatness, both in terms of political power, in terms of being better and stronger human beings. Even sciences and knowledge in general evolved immensely when the teachings of the Quran were being followed. At the other end of the spectrum, what happens if we ignore the message of the Quran at a national level? When we ignore the teachings of the Quran, nations will fall. And the Prophet had predicted that. Once the Arab nations put the Quran and the message of the Quran on the side, look at what has happened to them. So in the entire world, they are nowhere. They might have material resources, but in terms of importance or in terms of respect, they are absolutely nowhere. If we look at our own country, we started out with a lot of promise. Our whole premise of the country was that we are going to establish a Muslim state, that we are going to follow the teachings of the Quran. Our constitution actually says that we will not pass any laws repugnant to the Quran and the Sunnah, but unfortunately that's just in writing. So we do not follow the teachings of the Quran as a nation, and we also, are falling as a nation. So the question might arise, what about non-Muslim nations? And if you think about it, with non-Muslim nations, they haven't even been given the Quran. So if Allah's given the Quran to the Muslims, and the Muslims forsake and do not consider the message of the Quran, the punishment will come first to the Muslims. The non-Muslims actually have an excuse. The Quran was not revealed to them. So it is totally logical that those who were given the message and are not taking the message seriously should be punished first. And that is exactly what's happening. Until we turn this around, Allah will keep punishing us until we learn a lesson. The next is a brief hadith where I'm not going to take the full hadith, but just one aspect of the key message. This has been narrated by Hazrat Abu Bakr Razi Allah, where part of the message is that if someone views anything other than the Quran as a larger blessing than the Quran, then he is doing a great injustice to the Quran. So the point is, we look at somebody who has a lot of wealth, big house, big car, fancy estate, and we think that's the real blessing of God. But what we need to recognize is the real blessing of God is the Quran, the message that He's given us. And if anyone doesn't see things that way, doesn't see the Quran as the greatest blessing, then he's actually doing an injustice to the Quran. So we need to reflect ourselves where we stand. So do we think about the Quran as the biggest blessing from God, and do we treat it that way? That's an internal reflection that I need to do and each one of us needs to do. The final hadith that I will mention has been narrated by Hazrat Ali Razi Allah. This is a long hadith, and I'm just going to share a few excerpts from that hadith. It starts out where Hazrat Ali says that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that a major fitna will come. Now, fitna is an Arabic word that has many meanings. One meaning is, there will be a major trial, there'll be tribulation, there'll be challenges. So there will be this, or we can also say periods of unrest. So there will be this period that will come. Now, what Hazrat Ali then asked was the most logical question in terms of, actions. So he said, how will we get out of this fitna? How will we get out of this trouble? If you think about our own situation, had we been there, given the way we've been brought up and the way we've been educated, we would have said, okay, what will that fitna be? Where will it come from? How will it come? So we would ask all these where, when, why, how sorts of academic questions. But what Hazrat Ali asked was the most practical question. Okay, something's coming. He didn't ask exactly where it will come from, when it will come, what is the background and so on. He just asked the most logical, practical question, which is how do we deal with this? How do we get out of it? And the answer essentially was that you need to hold on to the book of God, the book of Allah, which is the Quran. And then, obviously, there are verses in the Quran also which says, hold on to the book of Allah and don't break into splinter groups and so on. So if we follow that advice, then we will be able to deal with the fitna. But we look at our Muslim nations today, we are all scattered, we are all, broken into pieces. We are not following the basic guidance of the Quran or the sayings of the Prophet, and that's why we are in the state that we are in. So there are many more points made in that hadith. I'll just say some of those and then we'll conclude. So towards the end of this hadith, the Prophet teaches us that whoever says something that is based on the Quran is saying the truth. Whoever makes a decision based on what is in the Quran is making the correct decision. Whoever takes actions based on the Quran, his actions and his reward is safe. And whoever calls others to the guidance of the Quran, his guidance is guaranteed. And that is actually a crucial point, because our job is to take guidance, our job is to learn the Quran ourselves and to take the guidance of the Quran to others. Whether it is taken by others or not taken by others is not in our control. But when we learn ourselves and communicate the message to others, the biggest beneficiary is us ourselves. So we need to think about that also. That means that there is a responsibility on us to learn the Quran and then take the message of the Quran to others. May Allah help all of us do that. May Allah help us learn the Quran, to implement the Quran in our lives, and to take the message of the Quran to those around us. Ameen bi rahmatika ya rabbal alameen wa ma alayna illa al balagh al mubin.